Good evening. It's Wednesday, August 12th. The Democratic Party's newly minted presidential ticket comes out firing.
Donald Trump has already started his attacks, whining about how she is, quote, mean to his appointees. It's no surprise, because whining is what Donald Trump does best.
Kamala Harris.
We don't have to accept the failed government of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. In just 83 days, we have a chance to choose a better future.
Appear together at a high school gymnasium in Biden's hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. Political newcomer Marjorie Taylor Greene, mocked as a supporter of QAnon conspiracies and denounced for videos deemed racist even by fellow Republicans, coasts to victory in a Republican primary runoff election in Georgia and looks like a shoo-in for Congress in November. 6 former Environmental Protection Agency chiefs called today for a reset at the agency after President Donald Trump's regulation-chopping, industry-minded first term. California Governor Gavin Newsom says the state is showing improvement in its fight against the coronavirus, citing a significantly lower number of confirmed new cases as the state begins to clear backlogged cases from a data failure. The governor predicts the state is turning the corner on the pandemic. Prison rights advocates issue yet another call for the governor to increase releases of those incarcerated at San Quentin, where coronavirus infections continue to spread and the deaths mount. And thousands of protesters rally in Belarus's capital and other cities for a fourth straight night, decrying an election they say was rigged to extend the 26-year rule of the country's authoritarian ruler and his crackdown on the subsequent demonstrations. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris delivered an aggressive 1-2 attack on the character and performance of President Donald Trump today, as they made their election case for the first time as running mates. Biden, a 77-year-old white man, embraced the significance of naming the first black woman to a major party's presidential ticket, but he also focused on other attributes Harris brings to the ticket. He hailed the California senator, the 55-year-old former prosecutor, who a year ago excoriated Biden on a primary debate stage as the right woman to help him defeat Trump and then lead a nation facing crises in triplicate: a pandemic, a wounded economy, and a long-simmering reckoning with racism. Harris and Biden appeared together at a high school gymnasium in his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. Christopher Martinez reports.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made their first appearance as running mates Wednesday, months after the two Democrats tangled in the Democratic presidential primary. Biden had promised to nominate a woman, and his pick of Harris marks the first time a black woman and Asian American has been on a national Democratic or Republican ticket. Biden calls Harris a smart, tough fighter who will be ready to govern on day one. He also says Harris, the daughter of immigrants from India and Jamaica, will be an inspiration.
And this morning, all across the nation, little girls woke up, especially little black and brown girls, who so often feel overlooked and undervalued in their communities. But today, just maybe, they're seeing themselves for the first time in a new way as the stuff of president and vice presidents.
Harris had run for the Democratic presidential nomination, but her campaign never really took off, and she dropped out of the race almost 2 months before the first primary. Probably her biggest moment in that campaign came in a debate where she blasted Biden for his past opposition to federal integration busing and his ability to work with segregationists in the Senate. But they've buried that hatchet, and Harris now has praise for Biden.
The civil rights struggle is nothing new to Joe. It's why he got into public service. It's why he helped reauthorize the Voting Rights Act and restore unemployment discrimination and employment discrimination laws. And today, he takes his place in the ongoing story of America's march toward equality and justice as the only who has served alongside the first black president and has chosen the first black woman as his running mate.
Harris took aim at the Trump-Pence administration, saying everything that people care about is on the line in this election. She blasted Trump for what she describes as mismanagement of the pandemic and the related economic crisis, as well as what she calls a moral reckoning with racism. Harris says Trump has made each of those challenges worse.
He inherited the longest economic expansion in history from Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And then, like everything else he inherited, he ran it straight into the ground. Because of Trump's failures of leadership, our economy has taken one of the biggest hits out of all the major industrialized nations, with an unemployment rate that has tripled as of today. This is what happens when we elect a guy who just isn't up for the job. Our country ends up in tatters, and so does our reputation around the world.
Ideologically, Biden has been widely seen as more to the center of the Democratic Party compared to Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Kamala Harris cuts a rather complicated figure, with a record as prosecutor that some progressives see as reflecting an older law and order agenda, while Harris says she's trying to change the system from within. Republicans are blasting Harris as an extremist. Trump 2020 campaign spokesperson Tim Murtaugh says Biden and Harris make up, in his words, the most extreme leftist ticket in American major party history. Joe Biden is not surprised by such attacks.
You all knew it was coming. You could have set your watches to it. Donald Trump has already started his attacks, calling Kamala, quote, nasty, whining about how she is, quote, mean to his appointees. It's no surprise, because whining is what Donald Trump does best, better than any president in American history. Is anyone surprised Donald Trump has a problem with a strong woman or strong women across the board?
Biden and Harris are scheduled to accept the Democratic nomination at the National Party Convention next week. After that, Harris says she's ready to get to work.
I know we are going to bring our country closer to realizing its great promise. But to do it, we'll need to work, organize, and vote like never before, because we need more than a victory on November 3rd. We need a mandate that proves that the past few years do not represent who we are or who we aspire to be.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
Reaction to Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris as his vice presidential running mate. Barbara Arnwine is founder and president of the Transformative Justice Coalition and former executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law.
Last week, August 6th, was the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. This announcement is yet again the fulfillment of the promise of that act. I have been watching social media all day. People are still dancing, celebrating. There is such exuberance over this nomination, especially from women of color. It is just amazing to see the reaction, because people know that they're living in a historic moment that was prophesized, that was fought for centuries. This is, I think, the capstone of proving that the 21st century for the Democratic Party has been the century of the black woman voter.
Ruth Conniff is executive editor of the Wisconsin Examiner and an editor-at-large for the Progressive magazine.
I am mindful that a lot of progressives feel not super thrilled about Kamala Harris's centrism. She shares Joe Biden's centrist politics. She has a long history as a prosecutor. As you all know, the best, living in California, was a tough-on-crime prosecutor, which is a bit of a mismatch with the current moment of Black Lives Matter and a real national coming to grips with the systemic racism of our justice system. But it is historic, and it is symbolic, and it's a big deal to have a black woman who could very likely be vaulted to the presidency in the Trump era. And, her background is progressive. She, comes out of a civil rights activist family. And the other thing is she's just a smart and savvy politician. So like Biden, she has pivoted to a more progressive politics as the country has moved there. And so I think it is likely, as Jeff Cohen said in a press release from Roots Action and the Progressive Democrats of America, that her savvy political instincts will likely make her more of a progressive, because that is where the Democratic Party's base and the whole country is going.
More from correspondent Lily Wolke, who filed this report.
This is exciting for her. It's exciting for the country, but frankly, it is exciting for the possibilities that exist for the little black girl sitting watching this to recognize that she can aspire to lead this country in a variety of ways.
It means a lot to a lot of people that California Senator Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's pick for vice president, says Linda Carr. She co-founded Higher Heights almost a decade ago to promote black women in politics, and she says the face of leadership is changing.
In addition to having a black woman running as a vice president running mate, there's a record number of women who ran for office in 2020. And there's a record number of black women who are nominees, both Republican and Democrat.
The attacks on Harris came quickly. President Trump and his allies critique she's too liberal. During the presidential primary, Harris embraced some more progressive policies than Biden, but she's been more criticized by some left-wing Democrats for her record as a tough prosecutor. Harris would be the first black and Asian American vice president and the first black woman to be a major party's nominee. University of Florida professor Sharon Austin studies African American women in politics. She's not surprised Biden chose Harris.
During the campaign, during debates, she handled herself extremely well. Her campaign was going well. She just ran out of funding, and that's something that happens to a lot of female candidates and a lot of candidates of color.
Good news at the polls yesterday. Elections for 2 state runoffs and 4 primaries went fairly smoothly. Connecticut held the country's last Democratic presidential primary just before next week's mostly virtual Democratic National Convention. In Georgia and Wisconsin, which had 2 of this year's most fraught elections, there were no hours-long lines or poll worker shortages and fewer absentee ballots lost in the mail. Milwaukee, Wisconsin's biggest city, had 168 polling places, still not the usual 180, but a lot better than just 5 in April. In Atlanta, faith leader and civic organizer Billy Michael Honor worked election protection.
There were the normal just failures of administration. There were some polling sites that just weren't open at 7 for whatever reason. And that happens. We see that, unfortunately, every time.
Still, Georgia's turnout was lower than its June primary, typical for a runoff election. For November, Honor recommends as much early voting as possible.
I just think that there are lots of people who are trying to make elections better and trying to protect people's right to vote and people's votes to be counted. And I think their work is paying off in a lot of ways, but there's still a long way to go.
In 2 closely watched races, Minnesota's 5th District freshman representative Ilhan Omar beat her well-funded Democratic primary challenger, attorney Antone Mountain Moe. And Marjorie Taylor Greene won Georgia's Republican runoff for the 14th House District, despite critiques of her past racist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic comments and her support for fringe conspiracy theory QAnon. From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
And more on that congressional race in northwest Georgia from reporter Sarah Walton.
Marjorie Taylor Greene won a primary runoff in Georgia's strongly Republican 14th congressional district. During her campaign, she expressed support for QAnon, a conspiracy theory centered around the existence of a deep state and involving a child sex trafficking ring. But Greene has also been criticized for anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic and racist comments made on social media. She's now widely expected to win a seat in the House of Representatives at the election in November. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
President Trump did congratulate Taylor Greene on her primary victory yesterday. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan has given the green light to voting centers across the state for the November election. The move comes as an alternative to opening 1,600 polling stations around the state, which local election officials said they wouldn't be able to safely staff out of coronavirus concerns. Diane Bernard has the story.
The voting centers will be in about 360 locations, including high schools, and can be used by any voter in a county. The move comes after the Republican governor declared this will be a traditional in-person election. Tiara Bradford with Common Cause Maryland says it's a victory for local election officials and those who warned against opening so many polling places during a pandemic. Bradford still hopes Hogan will change his mind and call for a mail-in only vote.
We really do believe the best way to carry out the election during times of these is to mail ballot to everyone and still have in-person voting as an option for people who may need it. But the majority of people most likely want to fill out their ballot through the mail just in order to stay safe and to protect themselves.
In a letter to the Board of Elections on Monday, Hogan said he remains very concerned about the plan's potential of creating long lines in unsafe conditions with crowds of people forced into too few polling places. Bradford says the entire issue could be avoided if the election was mail-in only. She points out that even with counties operating a few voting centers, there still may be a shortage of election judges. And with November just around the corner, she says her group will now be advising voters of their rights and how to cast ballots.
We'll just have to start switching gears and focusing on educating people about what their voting options are, encouraging people to fill out their absentee ballot applications now. Ask for your absentee ballots if you do want to do vote by mail, because it's not going to be directly mailed to you.
She adds Common Cause will meet with Hogan today to encourage the idea of mail-in ballots for all voters. As of last week, Maryland's local election boards were short by about 14,000 election judges, and committed judges continue to drop out. Support for this reporting was provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. For Public News Service, I'm Diane Bernard.
6 former Environmental Protection Agency chiefs called today for a reset at the agency after President Donald Trump's regulation-chopping, industry-minded first term, backing a detailed plan by former EPA staffers that ranges from renouncing political influence in regulation to boosting climate-friendly electric vehicles. The current administrator, Andrew Wheeler, immediately rejected the recommendations, and his spokesman, James Hewitt, accused Wheeler's predecessors of having botched environmental matters during their tenures. Most living former EPA heads signed on, one notable exception, Trump's first EPA chief, Scott Pruitt. The group, William Riley, Lee Thomas, Carol Browner, Christine Todd Whitman, Lisa Jackson, and Gina McCarthy, served under Republican and Democratic presidents. The Environmental Protection Network, a bipartisan group of more than 500 former EPA senior managers and employees, crafted the hundreds of pages of recommendations for a change of course at the agency. The group said the roadmap was meant to guide whatever administration the November 3rd presidential election puts in place, although many of the proposals are implicitly or explicitly critical of the Trump EPA's actions. The former EPA heads accompanying the statement did not mention Trump by name, but said they were concerned about the current state of affairs at the Environmental Protection Agency. Donald Trump Jr., President Trump's eldest son, and Nick Ayers, the former chief of staff for Vice President Mike Pence, have come out in opposition to final government approval of the Pebble Mine, a vast gold and copper mine to be dug near salmon fisheries not far from the pristine Bristol Bay in Alaska. The two men said they hoped the president would block development of the mine by a Canadian company in the interests of protecting the area's sensitive environment. Under President Trump, the Environmental Protection Agency reversed an Obama-era decision to block the project, allowing an environmental review by the United States Army Corps of Engineers to proceed. The final version of the review, released last month, found that the project would not result in long-term changes in the health of the commercial fisheries in Bristol Bay. A decision to grant a permit to the project is expected in about another month. The sockeye salmon runs of Bristol Bay, Alaska, are world-renowned. Donald Jr. is a well-known hunter and sportsman. President Trump says he will hear the arguments of his son out. More from reporter Eric Tegetoff.
Conservation, tribal, and fishing groups are condemning the Army Corps of Engineers' recommendation to permit the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay, Alaska. The groups say the open pit mine operation would have dire consequences for some of the world's most productive salmon streams. Steve Cohn, director of the Nature Conservancy in Alaska, says the Army Corps' final environmental impact statement did not adequately evaluate the project.
There are a number of factors at play that just make this the wrong mine in the wrong place. It's an extremely wet environment, seismically active. It's a proposed mine that straddles 3 watersheds, and it's a globally significant ecosystem.
The Army Corps' final analysis said the mine would not cause significant harm to the watershed. More than half of the world's sockeye salmon come from Bristol Bay. The mine has implications for the entire Northwest. The salmon industry generates $493 million a year in the region. Norman Van Vector, who heads the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation, says all the major salmon processors are headquartered in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle, and Bristol Bay draws workers.
Probably close to 2/3 of the participants that are fishermen harvesters call the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, and Oregon their home.
Local tribes also feel their concerns about the project have been ignored. Gayla Hassith with the Bristol Bay Native Association says the mine hasn't been permitted yet, but is already affecting the tribal members in the area.
You really enjoy the moment that you are in for the right now, but you always have Pebble Mine in the back of your head of, we don't ever want this to go away. This area has to be protected.
The Army Corps will make its final decision on issuing a permit in the fall. The Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation, Bristol Bay Native Association, and the Nature Conservancy want the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to reject the Clean Water Act permit for the mine. For Public News Service, I'm Eric Tegetoff.
Mauritius says it's seeking compensation from the owners of a Japanese ship that spilled oil after it grounded in the shallow waters off the Indian Ocean island nation, while urgent efforts continue to pump out the remaining fuel. The ship has spilled 1,000 tons of its cargo of 4,000 tons of oil into the sea, fouling the coastline of Mauritius, including a protected wetlands area that threatens 35 years of work to restore the area. An estimated 2,500 tons of fuel has been pumped away from the ship, stranded on a coral reef at a sanctuary for rare wildlife. Workers are racing to empty the ship before it breaks up in heavy seas and further pollutes the shore. Tourism is a major industry for Mauritius. This week, census takers have begun visiting homes that haven't returned their 2020 census forms, seeking out people who live in hard-to-count, especially isolated rural areas, like an estimated 900,000 people in the state of New Mexico. Roz Brown reports.
Jacob Vigil with New Mexico Voices for Children says even a 1% undercount would be a huge loss of federal funds. In fact, about $3,000 per person for a total loss of $600 million over the next 10 years. He says there's still time to participate online, by phone, or by returning forms sent earlier this year.
Most of the work is done through self-reporting, and that's the best way. But then after that, the Census Bureau actually sends out enumerators and personnel out through the country to capture those folks who did not self-report.
There is now greater urgency to boost New Mexico's flagging census participation after the Trump administration unexpectedly moved the deadline from October 31st to the end of September. The census count determines how much money communities receive for things such as hospitals, schools, roads, infrastructure, and water systems. Vigil says in addition to tribal communities, children are nearly always undercounted in the census.
So we're talking about Medicaid, we're talking the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance, school lunches, like SNAP, a lot of different programs that directly impact children.
Last week, the Census Bureau reported the self-response rate for the country was about 63%, while New Mexico's rate was 10 points lower at 53%. Vigil believes that can be improved.
Being currently the lowest response state and a state with large numbers of undercounted populations, including children of color, tribal communities, it's really imperative that we get that accurate count. We have enough time to do that.
The U.S. Census Bureau gave no explanation as to why the deadline had been moved up, but Democratic lawmakers, including New Mexico's congressional delegation, criticized the changed deadline, saying it was done to deliberately undercount groups that tend to support their party. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
The U.S. Census and its tribal partners are pushing to get an accurate count of Native Americans. Antonia Gonzalez reports.
The Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma is among tribes urging its citizens to complete census forms to ensure funding for public safety, schools, highways, healthcare, and other services. Brad Gernand with the Choctaw Nation talked about the tribe's campaign to inform citizens and avoid an undercount from 10 years ago during a census call this summer with reporters.
We learned that a lot of the cities and counties in our treaty territory, which is 11,000 square miles, comprising about 11 counties of Oklahoma. We learned that a lot of the governments and areas were not organizing for the census, so we stepped in and offered to partner with them, and we helped them pull together county by county complete count committees. And we're partnering with them by providing them data on some of the economic losses they've incurred as a result of the census undercount here. And we are currently operating a major media campaign. We're prepared to spend over $1 million in promoting and getting word out about the census.
The census can be completed online, mailed in, or by telephone now through the end of September. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
Los Angeles police say they are investigating a possible hoax call that led to the department's SWAT team responding on the block of one of the city's leading Black Lives Matter activists. Melina Abdullah, co-founder of BLM LA and a Cal State Los Angeles professor, began streaming live video on Instagram this morning, showing armed officers outside her house. According to the Los Angeles Times, the video showed officers screaming orders at her when she came outside. Abdullah said on the video that she was concerned about the safety of her children who were home at the time. Nobody was hurt in the incident. A police spokesman told the LA Times that the department was investigating what was most likely a swatting. Swatting refers to a phony emergency call made to attract police to a particular address without cause. Some such calls have led to fatalities and injuries of innocent people when police take action. Rubenstein, the police department spokesperson, said a call was made about a house on the block where Abdullah lives, but he would not specify the exact address or whether police think she was an intended target. Kentucky's Attorney General has met with a family of Breonna Taylor amid the ongoing investigation into her fatal shooting by police. Daniel Cameron has faced calls for weeks from protesters to charge the Louisville police officers who shot Taylor on March 13th. Cameron's office says he met with Taylor's mother and other family members this morning and personally expressed his condolences. Taylor was killed while police were serving a no-knock narcotics search warrant at her apartment. They found no drugs in her home. Cameron has asked everyone to be patient during the investigation. Earlier this month, he said he was waiting on ballistic tests from the FBI. The U.S. affiliate of UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Organization, has announced its first major program supporting children in the United States. For more than 70 years, UNICEF USA has supported the global work of that UN agency, most of it focused on aiding children in developing countries. UNICEF USA's president says his agency will be investing $1 million this year on an initiative to help U.S. cities become more child-friendly. Today's announcement comes amid overlapping domestic crises of the coronavirus and racial injustice. Houston, Minneapolis, and San Francisco are the first cities to commit. Prince George's County in Maryland is expected to follow soon. The goal is to encourage cities to make themselves safer for children. and ensure there is equitable access to social programs, parks, and playgrounds. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org. This is an hour-long newscast that airs each night at 6. There's a half-hour edition on the weekends, and you can hear it whenever you like. It's archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. Lawyers for a jailed Zimbabwean journalist have asked a court to force prison authorities to stop what they call the blatant and malicious stripping away of his rights, including lack of access to appropriate food and warm clothing. The efforts to improve jail conditions for Hopewell Chinono came as South African envoys are in Zimbabwe to investigate reports of widespread arrests and human rights abuses. The envoys are part of a delegation appointed by the African National Union. Garakai Chonza reports from Harare, Zimbabwe.
The African Union announced it would launch its probe after widespread reports on the deterioration of human rights and growing political intolerance exhibited by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. The deputy spokesperson for the country's main opposition political party, the Movement for Democratic Change Alliance, Clifford Trattler, says the intervention by the AU is long overdue.
We welcome the efforts by the region to intervene in the deepening governance and human rights crisis in Zimbabwe. The crisis in Zimbabwe has been characterized by a de facto state of emergency, a crackdown on citizens, abductions, arbitrary arrests of government critics, and the political persecution of professionals, including journalists, doctors, teachers, and nurses.
Human rights and public interest groups have warned about human rights violations since the inauguration of President Mnangagwa in July of 2018. The representative body of civic society groupings, the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, says the African Union delegation should involve all stakeholders if they want to resolve the Zimbabwean crisis. Rashid Mahia chairs the coalition.
We acknowledge the attention that has been given to the Zimbabwean human rights situation. Our concerns, however, are that the solution is not an internal party process, is not an inter-party dialogue process, is not an intra-party dialogue process, but it should be a national process, a process that brings all stakeholders to define the Zimbabwean question, the challenges that we are facing, and the way forward.
Henry Chimbiri is a victim of state-sponsored violence and the father of one of the female opposition political activists, Cecilia Chimbiri, who was recently abducted by suspected state agents. Chimbiri hopes that AU will condemn President Mnangagwa for persecuting citizens with divergent political views.
Victimization, harassment, violence has taken center stage in Zimbabwe. We live in fear. My daughter is also a victim of violence, a victim of torture, a victim of state abduction. And this same government always say we did not do it.
In a televised State of the Nation address last week, President Mnangagwa said he had no apologies for arresting citizens who he described as being anti-Zimbabwe.
We will overcome attempts at destabilization of our society by a few rogue Zimbabweans acting in league with foreign detractors. Those who promote hate and disharmony will never win. The bad apples that have attempted to divide our people and to weaken our systems will be flushed out.
Since he became president through a military coup that ousted his long-time ally, the late Robert Mugabe, in November 2017, Mnangagwa has failed to live up to his reformist promises. Human rights abuses under his rule include arrests of journalists and human rights defenders, torture, enforced abductions, and brutal attacks on opposition activists and protesters. For Pacifica Radio KPFA, I am Garikai Chaunza in Harare, Zimbabwe.
Thousands of protesters rallied in Belarus's capital and other cities for a fourth straight night, decrying an election they say was rigged to extend the 26-year rule of the country's authoritarian leader and his crackdown on the subsequent demonstrations. In several parts of Minsk, groups of hundreds of people formed human chains. Motorists blared horns in support and in some areas slowed to a crawl to block police vehicles. On one avenue, people stood on balconies, clapping in an expression of support. A group of riot police arrived and fired rubber bullets at them. Similar protests were held in at least 5 other cities, according to the Vyasna Rights Group, to contest the official election results, which show President Alexander Lukashenko won a 6th term with 80% of Sunday's vote, and the main opposition challenger garnered just 10%. Crowds have taken to the streets every night since to demand a recount. Earlier in the day, groups of hundreds of women formed human chains in several districts of Minsk, chanting shame and calling for an end to the crackdown on the demonstrations. Hesitant to use force against all-women rallies, police dispersed them without violence. But in recent nights, authorities have responded with a level of brutality remarkable even during Lukashenko's rule. Police have dispersed protesters with tear gas, stun grenades, water cannons, and rubber bullets, and severely beat many of them with truncheons. Black uniformed officers chased protesters into residential buildings and deliberately targeted journalists, beating many and breaking their cameras. More from reporter Julia Chapman in Moscow.
More than 7,000 Belarusians have been arrested since Sunday night. Wide-ranging internet blackouts have also created challenges for those trying to gather. Lukashenko has been in power since 1994. His main challenger, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, was forced to flee the country to neighbouring Lithuania earlier this week. Julia Chapman, Moscow.
California is showing improvement in its fight against the coronavirus. That's what Governor Gavin Newsom said today, citing a significantly lower number of confirmed new cases, and the state begins to clear backlogged cases from a data failure.
5,400, too high, but a lot lower than we've been tracking the last few weeks. Again, another indication that we are turning the corner on this pandemic.
The latest figures represent a significant drop from the record 12,807 new daily cases reported statewide during the spike in infections last month. Newsom said he was also encouraged by a downward trend in the state's hospitalization rate, which he noted is down 21%, and intensive care unit admissions, which are down 15% over the past 14 days. More than 10,600 people statewide have died, including a reported 180 today, with the great majority in Los Angeles County. Newsom again stressed adhering to public health orders, to socially distance and wear masks. Newsom said it's the only way the state will beat the pandemic and regrow the economy.
You can't begin a conversation about economic development and economic recovery without asserting what I think is universally accepted, at least in the context of those experts that we work with and my own subjective beliefs and that is the most urgent economic recovery tool for the business community. The one that we need the most is to stabilize this virus, to bend the curve of this pandemic, to do everything in our power to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. That's foundational. I don't think there is fundamentally anything more important for our economic future than this fundamental fact.
While the virus's spread may be slowing in California, the economic effects are still raging. The state has processed more than 9.7 million claims for unemployment insurance since the pandemic began. Newsom commended President Trump and the Congress for allotting an additional jobless boost of $600 a month, one that recently expired. Then he lambasted President Trump's proposal to allot a lower amount in additional aid to the unemployed. First it was $400 a week, now it's $300, and Newsom says, whatever it is, it's not enough.
We were very proud and pleased and very thankful of Congress, the president, for endorsing the CARES Act, for getting that $600 contribution. I think it's substantially mitigated the economic consequences of this pandemic. I think it substantially aided the capacity for businesses to remain open because of consumer spending and consumer confidence, even during that difficult period of time that maintained itself at a level that it otherwise would never have. I think it is a historic blunder if we are unable to accommodate the needs of tens of millions of Americans with subsequent supplemental on unemployment insurance. And I believe personally and professionally that $300 is simply inadequate to do that.
Newsom also said he's working with the Democratic lawmakers and other stakeholders to avert a possible avalanche of evictions across the state. As an eviction moratorium is set to expire soon, the Judicial Council of California will vote tomorrow to resume eviction proceedings through the courts beginning September 1st. Newsom said that timing gives lawmakers a chance to pass a law that would continue eviction protections into next year. New laws generally don't take effect until January 1st unless lawmakers can muster a 2/3 vote to pass an urgency clause to take effect immediately. But Newsom said, quote, "We have a pathway we believe to put something in place that would work very nicely," end quote. Meanwhile, prisoner rights advocates and the unincarcerated and the incarcerated issued another call for Governor Newsom to increase releases from San Quentin State Prison, where coronavirus infections continue to spread and deaths mount. Over 2,500 people living and working at San Quentin State Prison have contracted COVID-19. Nearly 70% of the inmates at San Quentin have tested positive for the virus. 25 of them and one prison guard have died since prisoners infected with the virus were transferred into San Quentin from a detention facility in Southern California. KPFA's Chris Lee filed this report.
The results of the prison transfer are disturbing. More than 2/3 of San Quentin's population has now contracted the coronavirus. 25 of them have died. But what's more disturbing, says James King, state campaigner for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, is the pattern of deliberate indifference by prison officials that led up to the May transfer.
The pattern in the timeline is disturbing. In April, San Quentin turned down free testing for guards and incarcerated people. In mid-May, 1,000 gallons of hand sanitizer were donated to San Quentin. It was accepted but never distributed, reportedly because a donation form was not properly filled out. San Quentin was over 110% capacity at the time of the transfer.
On May 30th, the CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, transferred 121 inmates from a state prison in Chino, the California Institution for Men, which was then badly infected with COVID-19, to San Quentin State Prison, again King.
Many of the people being transferred had not been tested for 2 weeks prior. On June 1st, the day after the transfer, Dr. Matthew Willis, Marin County's top public health officer, met with the warden of San Quentin and warned the prison to radically sequester the people who just transferred in. That advice was ignored. 10 weeks after the transfer, the prison is still over 100% capacity.
Prior to the transfer, San Quentin had no cases of COVID-19, despite overcrowding. After the transfer, cases climbed quickly. That led a group of public defenders and private attorneys to file habeas corpus petitions on behalf of dozens of inmates at San Quentin, citing Eighth Amendment provisions against cruel and unusual punishment, arguing for their early release. However, the San Francisco Public Defender's Office says all of those inmates have not been released despite a court ruling last month by Marin County Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Howard ordering the CDCR to immediately release 21 inmates at San Quentin. Juan Marino Haynes is an award-winning incarcerated journalist reporting from inside San Quentin State Prison. Haynes says he caught COVID-19 and has since shared a cell with 3 different people.
People have to be released. What they're actually doing right now in North Block and San Quentin is just shuffling people around. There's tents on the yard. There's big in the furniture factory. They're even big in the church. Just this week, a sergeant in this building died.
55-year-old Sergeant Gilbert Bobby Polanco died due to complications from COVID-19. Haynes says San Quentin has recently established field hospitals inside the prison in order to reduce the strain on outside medical institutions. 3 separate class action lawsuits were also filed in federal court on behalf of prisoners throughout the CDCR prison system, but those legal actions have yielded little result, according to co-litigator Michael Bean. He says the first goal of those lawsuits is to thin the prison population, which is still currently over 100% capacity across all state prisons.
72% of the people who've died to date have been people of color. Interestingly, something that we've been pointing out to the courts, to CDCR, 72% have also been people with disabilities, either people with serious mental illness or people with other ADA-recognized disabilities. Again, these tend to be the same people who also have pre-existing medical conditions.
Bean says the average age of people dying of COVID-19 in prison is 64. He also says that of the 6,500 medically vulnerable prisoners Governor Gavin Newsom had slated for early release back in April, only 8 have been released. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
Civil rights attorneys allege that although about 1,900 COVID-19 test kits were sent to the Immigrant Detention Center in Adelanto, California, Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials refused to allow the vast majority of them to be used. KPFK Radio's Dan Fritz reports from Los Angeles.
The ACLU says the refusal to give tests to people who are symptomatic of the virus infection is medically and morally repugnant. A previous order to follow CDC guidelines was issued on April 23rd as part of a preliminary injunction in a lawsuit concerning conditions at Adelanto. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, the ACLU says emails and other materials revealed substantial violations of the CDC guidelines, including on COVID-19 testing. The filing says that on May 23rd, an official at the private company Geo Group, which operates the Adelanto Center on contract, sent a message that about 1,900 test kits, enough to test all people detained and staff members at Adelanto, were shipped overnight to the facility. The ACLU alleges Geo planned to begin offering testing to all staff and all detainees on the day the test kits arrived, but ICE halted the plan. Dan Fritz, Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles.
You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
San Francisco's Mayor London Breed has announced the city is spending nearly $500,000 on responding to the coronavirus pandemic. That money is coming from other services. That's why she's urging city residents to heed public health orders to curb the spread and community transmission of the coronavirus. Breed warns should the pandemic continue beyond next year, it would drain more city resources. KPFA's Christina Onnested reports.
San Francisco Mayor London Breed says she plans to spend $446 million to address the coronavirus pandemic this year through June 2021. That includes $56 million to boost mobile testing sites in the most impacted neighborhoods, like the Latinx community in the Excelsior and the Mission, and the Black community in the Bayview and Tenderloin. Breed ticks off a list of services that money will go towards this fiscal year.
It includes $16.5 million in funding for communications and operations, $185 million for our health response, $62 million for food distributions and programs at our pit stops, and $183 million for our housing and shelter programs. It's important to remember that this funding really assumes that we don't see any major surges. If that happens, we will need to divert even more resources. And that's why it is so critical that everybody does their part to stop the spread. If this stretches beyond June, then there is going to be even more of a drain on our budget next year.
But the mayor warns the workable budget relies on federal reimbursements and CARES Act dollars. San Francisco, like other cities and states, is suffering a deficit due to the pandemic. Breed's budget relies on reserves to close an estimated $1.5 billion budget gap over the next 2 years. It also uses $93 million from the general fund. San Francisco has been on the government's watch list since late July due to increasing coronavirus infections. As Breed lists the latest numbers of coronavirus infections and deaths, she suggests there's no going back to normal.
As of today, we have 7,692 cases, and sadly, 67 people have died from COVID. Until we have a vaccine, until we are in a better place, we know that we need to continue to socially distance ourselves from one another, wear our mask as much as possible, and follow our public health guidelines. We have to start getting comfortable with it. We have to start changing our behavior. It really is what's going to make the difference.
There are some positive signs, says Public Health Director Dr. Grant Colfax. He says the rate of coronavirus hospitalizations are down, and other indicators show a slowing of community transmission.
We are currently caring for 88 San Franciscans with COVID-19 in our local hospitals. That is a slight drop from last week, but remember, it is an almost 25% reduction from our peak in July. We are currently finding about 85 new cases of COVID-19 every day. That number has started to drop from its high point a few weeks ago, but it is still a cause for great concern. Anything above 50 new cases per day puts us in the red zone, on our highest alert level, and we have been there for the past 7 weeks.
City officials are pushing for that number to go lower, so they can stop spread and reopen businesses. Colfax says social distancing, mask wearing, and avoiding gatherings will make that possible. I'm Christina Onnested reporting for KPFA.
Contra Costa County health officials say they will open 2 new testing centers in Richmond this week. That move comes amid an uptick in cases in the county in recent days. The county is also providing additional equipment at its 2 lab facilities to get test results in 1 to 2 days. The Oakland Unified School District and the Teachers Union, the Oakland Education Association, are announcing they've arrived at a tentative agreement on a memorandum of understanding about opening up Oakland's schools. The two sides say the deal regarding distance learning prioritizes, quote, teacher flexibility as well as a quality learning experience for students with consistent live interaction with their teachers and other OEA members. Oakland schools reopened with full distance learning on Monday for all students. Top official at the Federal Reserve criticized the decision by many states to reopen businesses this spring before getting the virus fully under control, and said those choices have hindered an economic recovery in the U.S. Eric Rosengren, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, says that states in the South and the West that allowed businesses to reopen after shutting down for a brief period did register an initial burst of economic activity, but spikes in infection rates soon followed, and the economies in those states are now lagging behind those in the Northeast as consumers became more cautious. Rosengren's comments are among the most specific yet by a Fed official, tying the health of the economy to the nation's ability to control the virus. Prominent Berkeley homeless activist Mike Lee has died. Lee was a core member of Berkeley's First They Came for the Homeless, or an organization that set up unhoused protest communities in places that were highly visible, like in front of the post office, then City Hall, then Berkeley Bowl, then at the Here There signs on the Oakland border. Here's Mike Lee in 2016 at a candidates forum in Berkeley. He was running for mayor under the slogan, "An old bum for mayor."
The most important issue facing America and Berkeley is homelessness. An open, festering sore, gushing blood onto the streets of America. Their cries of pain and suffering falling on the deaf ears of a Berkeley City Council, elected representatives who were willfully neglectful, choosing to respond either by criminalization or charity, refusing to provide a hand up and not a hand out.
Mike Lee did not become mayor, but he did make enough ruckus that Berkeley eventually found housing for him in the neighborhood where he'd been camping, South Berkeley. But getting him into an apartment did not keep him from taking to the streets. Reporter Danielle Kay spoke with some people who worked with him.
My name is Candace Elder, and I'm the founder and executive director of the East Oakland Collective. Mike is he's one of the greats when it comes to advocacy for the unhoused. You know, he was unhoused himself for a long time, and I'm getting kind of emotional, you know, as we speak, because, you know, when it came down to protecting our curbside communities, he was there picking up a bullhorn.
My name is Andrea Henson. I was the former lead organizer for Where Do We Go Berkeley, and now I'm an attorney at the Eviction Defense Center. When we were organizing a civil disobedience event where we were going to refuse to move when the police and Caltrans came to the encampments, Mike came down as well and pitched a tent to live in the I-80 University underpass encampment. Mike has always been incredibly dedicated. The thing that stood out the most is the fact that despite any disability, using a scooter or a wheelchair, he fought for the rights of others till his last breath.
Mike Lee spent this summer in and out of Alta Bates Hospital getting treated for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. Berkeley homeless activist Mike Lee dead at the age of 64. Partly cloudy around the San Francisco Bay with highs in the low 70s tomorrow. Further inland, it will be mostly sunny and then hot with highs near 100 degrees. In the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow, partly cloudy with a high of 103 degrees. In Los Angeles, clouds in the morning. The sun should appear by afternoon with highs in the upper 80s. That's it for the news tonight for this Wednesday, August 12th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Miracle. Good evening.
This is a community announcement for August 2020. On Friday, August 14th, At 12 p.m., the Alzheimer's Association of Northern California and Northern Nevada interviews San Francisco film fellow Darren Colston and screen his short film, Grandpa's Hands. The film shares an African-American family's perspective of a loved one's dementia journey and how race can be a factor in the journey. The program will be presented online via Zoom. Registration is required. To register, contact Carla Fields at katiefields@alz.org or call 925-444-0474. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing to calendar@kpfa.org. You can hear this listing again at 510-848-6767 extension 621 or view it online at kpfa.org.